his approach was vastly different to other leaders like Malcolm X and also the Black Panther movement. Okay, and so we're going to be kind of looking at how both of these sides kind of approach the same issue. Okay. Now, before we move on, yesterday you should have read the story of Emmett Till, and you should have read about the horrific, brutal murder of Emmett Till. Okay, and what you should have got from that story is that his mother makes a very crucial decision that impacts our country. Okay, she decides to have an open casket for her son. And by doing that, she lets the entire country and the entire world see what white supremacy has taken not only from her, but has done to her son. Okay. And so it has done to a lot of Black mothers throughout the United States history. And so Emmett Till's death is also said in that article to be a catalyst, to be a starter, to be the beginning point of the civil rights movement. And it's because it creates such strong emotions, not only in the Black community, but also in moderate whites who were kind of on the fence on supporting civil rights. Sorry, guys. And so on December 1st, on December 1st, 1955, okay, we should probably all know this story. So I'm kind of just reviewing right here. But on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks decides not to give up her seat to a white man. Okay, and she decides not to comply with the segregation policies of the Montgomery bus system. But what Rosa Parks was thinking about partially, okay, was about Emmett Till's death. She was still thinking about the incredible injustice that had been done to Emmett Till and his mother and to the Black community as a whole. And so part of her decision was made by that poor boy's death. Okay, and so Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat. She is arrested, and that sparks another huge wave of outrage. And so the citizens of Montgomery are upset, they are outraged, and they are looking for some type of leader. And the leader that is going to be chosen is going to be Martin Luther King Jr. Okay? And so he was a Baptist minister who came from Atlanta, Georgia. He settled in Montgomery with his very young wife and family at the time. And that's actually why he's chosen to be the leader for the Montgomery movement. Okay, he's chosen by another strong Black leader of Montgomery, Edward Nixon, mainly because of the fact that he hadn't been in Montgomery for a long time. Okay, so he's not kind of going to be influenced by either any kind of faction or side within the Black community as a whole. And so MLK is going to be really good at this. He was a very talented kind of natural leader, very smart. Okay, was able to go to college at the age of 15. Okay, and so he's able to rally the community together, and he decides to start a boycott, okay, or basically to not buy, sell, or interact with something. And he decides that the Black community is going to boycott the bus system. They are not going to use the buses anymore. He's very successful. He does not give in. MLK's house is going to be firebombed at one time. He's actually arrested. While he's arrested, the Supreme Court makes a huge decision on desegregating buses. But it's the success in Montgomery that really makes MLK a national figure, makes people actually know his name. And he is such a gifted speaker that he is going to become kind of the spokesperson for this movement. And so the Montgomery bus boycott, like I said, they are going to not ride those buses anymore, which was a huge problem for the transit system because African Americans made up 75% of their riders. And these riders went to work, generally places where Black people at the time could find work. So they were in factories, they were maids, nannies. And so this had a huge impact on the white community as a whole too. And so their workers were not able to get to their jobs. And we see that some white people kind of cross the line and they were also transporting Black people to different jobs. Okay, but for a year, okay, the Black community holds out. They do not ride the buses, and this causes a huge strain on the city of Montgomery's economy. And they're able to do this because MLK is constantly organizing carpools and meetings to keep everybody organized. And literally they just walk in rain, sleet, snow, hot weather. Remember, it's in Alabama, so you can imagine the summers. They walk and they walk and they walk. And as a community, they resist segregation and they are successful in getting the bus system repealed, okay, getting it desegregated. And so what this does is it shocks the nation a little bit, okay, and it shows the Black community that if they can come together as a unified force, that collective power can cause major, major change. Yeah. And so they started looking at other targets. They looked at the bus system, and we start seeing massive protests against different segregated bus systems. We see this actually in Dallas quite a bit with the bus system. And then we start seeing schools be the next target, okay, trying to get Black children to have equal education, okay, mainly because, and this is why I had y'all look at that major civil rights cases in Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court decided, you know what, segregation is legal as long as it is separate but equal. And what we see before desegregation is that these states that were enabling segregation are actually spending more money on Black students to try to get it equal. Okay, they are fighting so hard that they were just throwing money at the situation rather than just segregate or desegregate the schools. Okay, and so what we see is in 1954, the Supreme Court is going to make a decision. Okay, and they are going to rule that separate but equal for education was wrong, it's illegal, and that schools needed to integrate at deliberate speed. Okay, and what you should notice from that quote is it doesn't give you a time limit. It doesn't give you a date for when these schools should integrate. Okay, and that was a problem because honestly, education is kind of a tricky subject in terms of government because it's not the federal government. It's not Washington, D.C. people that have control over education. It's the state, okay? And so they left it up to the state to change, which for these southern states, they didn't want to change, and so they didn't. And so even though it was 3 years later in Arkansas, in the capital city, it was still not changed. And so in Little Rock, Arkansas, they are going to target that school specifically. They're going to choose 9 Black high school students who were incredibly great students, and they are going to forcibly integrate Little Rock High School. And unfortunately for these 9 teenagers, they run into a huge problem. Okay, the governor of Arkansas is going to literally send in the National Guard to block the doors and prevent these teenagers from going to school. And they are backed up by this giant angry white mob who is furious that they are forcing integration on their schools. And it literally takes the president of the United States to send in the army for the first time since the Reconstruction, okay, to actually integrate the school. Okay. But once Little Rock is integrated, we're going to see kind of a chain event in schools. Now, it is still going to be incredibly difficult for Black students to go to white schools, but we're going to see a chain of reaction after Little Rock. The next target, okay, is actually going to still be the buses, but it's going to be interstate travel. Okay, in 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court actually banned segregation in bus travel between states. But just like with the schools, it had still taken a long time for people to actually put those laws into place. The South was still actively resisting seating for whites and Blacks. Okay, and in 1960, the Supreme Court goes one step further, and they actually say that, you know what, all facilities associated with bus travel have to be integrated. You can't have a Black bathroom. You can't have a white bathroom. They need to be a men's restroom and a white or a women's restroom. Okay, and so we're going to see that students looking at the success of the bus boycotts are going to actively join together. Both Black and white students are going to go, and they are going to get on these buses in non-segregated cities, and then they are going to ride them through the Deep South, okay, and trying to get to New Orleans. Okay, that was their plan. Unfortunately, these 16 students who make the first Freedom Ride are going to, they do get into some resistance as they get into South Carolina, but when they get into Alabama, and as they get closer to Montgomery and closer to Birmingham, the police chief, we're going to talk more about later, Bull Connor, is going to allow the KKK 20 minutes before he sends his police officers to the scene. And so the bus is going to be forced off the road. The bus is going to be firebombed, which we're seeing right here. And then the KKK is literally going to bar the door, and they were fully intent, this white mob was fully intent on burning the passengers alive in the bus until they allowed them to come out, and then they were severely beaten. But the Freedom Riders did not give up. They actually got onto another bus later on after the cops finally showed up, and they kept making their way through Alabama. They were beaten again. But we see is that the violence of these white mobs and the KKK really drew a lot of attention to the cause. And we see actually hundreds of other students decide to also take up this cause. And then we see lots of Freedom Riders and Freedom Rides go down into the Deep South. And eventually they are successful in getting the president to act and force the bus system to integrate. The next target was restaurants. Okay, so inspired by Gandhi's nonviolent approach, inspired by the murder of Emmett Till, inspired by the bravery of the Freedom Riders, what we call the Greensboro Four, decided to go to White House Diner, which was a segregated restaurant. And they decided to sit at the whites only counter. And when they are refused service, they decide not to give up their seats, which is called a sit-in. So they are occupying those seats. And so the restaurant can't make money off of those seats anymore. And so it's supposed to put pressure on the restaurant. Okay, they stay there until close, and then the next day they go again. They are going to be arrested, but by that time, this gets spread. The Greensboro Four were incredibly smart, and they actually got media people to come and actually film them, and so this gets spread to neighboring cities in the surrounding area. And we see that hundreds of students join the protests, and they do similar sit-ins all across the country. Okay, and so we actually have sit-ins in 55 cities and 13 states. These are extremely successful, and so by the end of 1960, we see that most restaurants were starting to integrate as well. And so we kind of get this ball rolling, right? We've got schools starting to integrate. We've got bus systems starting to integrate. We've got interstate travel starting to integrate. We've got restaurants starting to integrate. And so trying to kind of capitalize on this momentum, we see the formation of this group known as SNCC. Okay? And they were the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they were going to be the main kind of driving force. And they trained students on how to use nonviolence as a way of protesting. And so they literally practiced getting hit, getting spit on, being called different racial slurs, trying to train these students to ignore their natural kind of instinct to fight back and to commit to using nonviolence as a way to promote civil rights. Okay, kind of with the inspiration and support of MLK. Okay, and so they're going to be incredibly influential in this time period. And so we've had really great success so far. Okay, and so MLK is going to decide to lead another boycott. And so this time, instead of the Deep South, they're going to go north, and they're going to go to Albany, New York. Okay, and they decide to attack this very broad range of different segregation. So they're going to tackle restaurants. They're going to tackle the bus system. They're going to attack schools. They're going to try to do as much desegregation as possible. And it attracts a lot of attention. But what we see in Albany is a huge kind of game changer. Okay, the chief of police in Albany decides not to use violence against the protesters. Okay, he does arrest thousands of protesters, but he doesn't do it in a violent manner. Okay, there's no police brutality. He actually orders his men not to use violence, to take these protesters in as peacefully as possible, because he knows that if he does that, he's going to give in to what MLK wants, which is this violence and cruelty and brutality being put on his protesters. Okay, and so fortunately, this is very successful. And after a year, they don't get a lot of results in Albany, and people get tired, and eventually the movement kind of falls apart. But Albany is going to be super important down the road for MLK because it changes his whole kind of viewpoint on how to use nonviolence. And so I think this is the thing where people get kind of twisted about Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, we get a lot of quotes about how peaceful he was and his use of nonviolence, and a lot of different politicians around his birthday use his quotes as trying to promote this kind of easy, peaceful way of protesting. But that's not what MLK was really about. Okay, now he does have these 6 key principles, but I think number 2 is a super big one. Okay, nonviolence seeks to win the friendship and understanding of the opponent and not to humiliate him. He understood, MLK understood that meeting violence with violence was only going to deepen hatred. Okay, it was only going to deepen divisions within the white and black community. And so what he decides to do is use nonviolence very, very strategically. Martin Luther King Jr. knew, especially after Albany, that he had to go where the brutality was going to be the worst. Because by using nonviolence, he was actually kind of pulling up a mirror to the rest of the country to show people, like, we are not doing anything, right? We're not fighting back. We're not punching back. All we are doing is requesting our civil rights, and look at how they treat us. And he wasn't against breaking laws. He broke laws that he deemed unjust, okay, that he saw as being discriminatory. And Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested a lot, like a lot. And so he's going to take in a lot of these lessons that he gained in Albany. He's going to apply that to the rest of the movement. And so he's going to specifically choose a new location where he's going to get the response that he's looking for. Okay, and instead of in Albany, where he had this broad range of different things he wanted to focus on, okay, in his next target, he's going to really narrow the focus. Okay, so all the attention is on that matter. And so it's not as spread out. Okay, he's going to concentrate his forces. The place where he decides to go is one of the most segregated places at the time in the United States. Okay? And he decides to go into the Deep South, and he decides to start a new campaign against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. Okay? And so he is going to lead his group, okay, the SCLC and SNCC, down into Birmingham, and they are going to start protesting against segregation. And he chooses Birmingham mainly because of the police chief down here. Okay, Bull Connor is the guy that we talked about with the Freedom Riders, and Bull Connor was a nasty piece of work and probably one of the worst Americans in history. Bull Connor was incredibly racist. He had several ties with the KKK. Definitely allowed a lot of freedom to the KKK to do different things in Birmingham. And so when the protesters come down into Birmingham, he's not going to learn from the police chief in Albany. He is going to meet the protesters with extreme violence. And this backfires on him just like MLK wanted, okay? Because these peaceful protesters are going to be met with fire hoses, with dogs. We're going to see that fire hoses are going to be turned not only on full-grown men, but on women and children. Thousands of African-American protesters and white volunteers are going to be beaten in the streets. And so all of these very incredibly violent acts are not only going to be kind of spread by mouth, we also have to take into account that by this time, most Americans own a TV. And so these scenes are going to be played on televisions all across the United States. And it brings a lot of attention to what MLK has been talking about. And then MLK is going to be arrested, and he's going to write probably one of his most famous works, which is Letter from Birmingham Jail. And that's, if you get a chance to read it in full, I mean, MLK is a brilliant man. And so I highly recommend reading it. But he's going to call on, say, like, and really address this idea that he needed to stop the protests, that he was causing the problem. And he's going to target moderates, people that were saying that African Americans need to wait, that they shouldn't be protesting in this manner. They shouldn't be so loud, that they were causing the violence and stuff like that. He is going to directly fight against those charges and kind of prop up everything that was going on in Birmingham. Like, we were peaceful. They turned dogs on us. And so the next target is going to have major implications. And this is something that we're still honestly fighting for in the United States today. Okay, this is still a major, major issue. And that's voter registration. Okay, you should know that voting has major, major implications on our country. And that voting is a right that is guaranteed to every American citizen. And it is a duty of every American citizen to go vote. And that voting can make a huge change. And because of that, a lot of African Americans were forcibly turned away from polls. There were a lot of different things that whites in the South under Jim Crow did to prevent whites from having a voice. Okay, and so in 1964, we're going to see that SNCC is going to launch what we call Freedom Summer. And so hundreds of volunteers, Black and white, go down to the South. They build schools, they build community centers, they get people registered to vote. Unfortunately, these volunteers are going to be targeted, and a lot of them were beaten and arrested. And unfortunately, the three young men at the top, Andrew Goodman, James Earl Chaney, and Michael Henry Schweiner, sorry, are going to be killed by the KKK. And so this just kind of spurs them forward. Okay, rather than break up the unit, they become more determined. And so actually, in that summer, two women and one man are going to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And this is going to be a party that's going to directly oppose at that time, which was basically an all-white white supremacy group of the Mississippi Democratic Party. And so they are successful. They get 2 delegates elected. Unfortunately, they are not seated at the Democratic Convention and don't really get the voice that they should have gotten from their people. But it was a huge success in getting people to start thinking about getting registered in connection to Freedom Summer. And because of the violence that was being brought on volunteers. Okay, 600 protesters on March 7th, led by Hosea Williams of the SCLC and John Lewis of the SNCC. They decided to lead a march of 600 protesters across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and to Montgomery, the capital of Mississippi, to deliver their grievances to the governor themselves. Edmund Pettus is actually named after a Confederate general, and so there's a little bit of symbolism in that. But as the protesters climb the bridge and as they come down, they are met by this huge swarm of local law enforcement, state troopers, police officers, off-duty cops who were mounted, and they are told to turn back. And when the protesters refuse to turn back, they are savagely beaten, savagely beaten. John Lewis almost loses his life. There's, I forgot the number of people who are actually killed in this beating. And what really kind of shocks America is that, I forgot the TV network, but literally, like, before the TV networks find out about what's going on, one of the networks was showing this documentary on the rise of the Nazis. And they were showing clips of the Nazis going through different German cities on Kristallnacht and beating Jews in the streets, or different signs that targeted Jews, and talking about the Nuremberg laws and all these horrible atrocities that the Germans had inflicted on the Jewish people. And then it cuts like immediately to what was going on in Mississippi, and the American public sees that it's happening in their own country, that people are being beaten, that people are being discriminated against. And so it kind of sets up this huge contrast that people are really shocked by. And the next day, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to call out to clergy, to the different religious groups. He's going to call to anyone that could come to Montgomery. And it takes a little bit to get a federal judge to allow the march to happen. But 25,000 people, including rabbis, priests, all people from all different walks of life, join in for another march on Selma. And they're not able to cross the bridge. Martin Luther King Jr. does actually turn them back after prayer, but they are eventually allowed to march a third time to Montgomery. And with this pressure, okay, and with the whole country seeing what had been going on in Selma on Bloody Sunday, okay, President Lyndon Johnson is going to sign in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is one of the most important voting rights legislation that we've ever seen in our country. Okay, the picture on the bottom right is actually of Obama on the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday, marching across along with John Lewis, who's to his, I mean, it'd be his right, but to the left of him, marching again across that bridge, which was a pretty amazing, emotional moment in our country's history. And so I just want to kind of show you a little bit of the impact of that Voting Rights Act. Okay, you can see in 1940, generally about 3% of the voting of all Blacks in the South were voting at that time. By 1976, we have 63% of all Blacks in the South who were of voting age registered to vote. Okay, we see this massive, massive change, and that is going to drastically help change a lot of things in the South. Okay, it's not perfect, but it got a lot better with the Voting Rights Act. Okay. And then we see that probably in his most famous march and famous speech, he is going to lead this massive, massive march on Washington, okay, on 1963, on the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South, and also the 8th anniversary of the death of Emmett Till. Okay, and this huge crowd gathers right outside the Lincoln Memorial, and MLK gives probably his most well-known speech, which is "I Have a Dream," where he calls for an end of racial injustice, a new age of American harmony, in this new world that they were creating together. And unfortunately, that really ends, or this vision really ends with his assassination. Okay. On April 4th, I guess, MLK is going to be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He had gone there to help sanitation workers try to unionize. He had actually given a really famous speech the night before. We kind of get a little bit of inkling that he definitely knew something was going on. But on April 4th, he's killed by a white supremacist while he's on his balcony at the motel that he was staying at. And the nation kind of splits. Okay, we see this kind of eruption happen across the country where Blacks are angry that this major leader has died and has been killed and taken from them once again. And we see major riots pop out in major cities where we see a lot of violence against the local police. We see a lot of violence and destruction against local inner city businesses that discriminated against Blacks. And the problem with this is it kind of turned off a lot of white moderates who were leaning towards supporting civil rights And we see kind of a similar thing with the Black Lives Matter movement, which we'll talk a lot more about. And I do want to kind of explore with y'all because there are some major similarities to what we have seen this last couple of years. Okay, so guys, that's kind of what I got for y'all today. Tomorrow we're gonna get into Malcolm X. We'll look at the violence and the more kind of forceful approach of the Black Panther movement, and then we'll compare them on Friday. Okay. Guys, have a great day, and I'll see y'all soon, hopefully.